This is a screen capture video for Unit 5.3, continuing with connective tissue and specifically with blood. I was just getting ready to show the red blood cells when I ended the other video, and I have an image of red blood cells here. This is through the microscope, greatly magnified and enlarged. Red blood cells are known as erythrocytes in science and biology, and what you're seeing here, you see the red blood cells. They're kind of a reddish, maroonish color. They're the smaller cells. The cells that have the purple and the darker purple inside, which would be the nucleus of those cells, those are white blood cells, and there's several different types of white blood cells that are shown. And you can see the red blood cells are not nearly as large as the white blood cells. These all the cells, both the red blood cells and the white blood cells, have been stained, picked up different stains, and that's what they're showing in this image. And one of the things you pick up by looking at the red blood cell is that it's not as thick in the middle as it is around the edges. And I have an illustration of a red blood cell in this other image that I'm showing, and you see it's kind of depressed. It's disc-shaped, but the disc is depressed on both sides in the middle. And that structure fits its function because these red blood cells are pushed through the circulatory system in the body under pressure, and by the time they get down to the capillary is about the diameter of a red blood cell. So these red blood cells are squeezed and pushed single file through the capillaries so that they make close contact with the capillary wall, with those epithelial cells. And epithelial cells are important in covering surfaces and for absorption, mostly for covering surfaces, but also for absorption when you consider the capillary walls and the walls of the lungs, the alveoli, just one cell thick. So this red blood cell comes into close contact with the capillary wall and thereby can exchange oxygen through that capillary wall more easily from the hemoglobin that's in the red blood cell through the capillary wall to the lymph that's on the other side. Red blood cells contain many, many millions of hemoglobin molecules, and from earlier discussion you remember that hemoglobin is an iron-containing protein, and it has a quaternary structure made up of 4 smaller molecules. The erythrocyte, the red blood cell, will be about 8 to 10 microns across, and that's smaller than the white blood cells. White blood cells are known as leukocytes, and I have an image of the different leukocytes. There are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. The bands I'm not so familiar with. That was a new one, but I went ahead and included this image because of the 5 different white blood cells. And when a pathologist looks at a blood sample, they look not only at the number of white blood cells in a blood sample, but the types of white blood cells. I was over at the Animal Disease Lab back probably in the 1990s, and they were looking at a blood sample from a dog, and the person in the lab made the comment that the dog had been sick at least 2 weeks, and she could tell by the number of white blood cells and the type. If I remember correctly, it was by the number of basophils, but more generally it was by the type of white blood cells and the number. White blood cells are very important in immunity. They move throughout the body. Red blood cells are restricted to staying in the blood vessels for the most part, unless there's an injury. White blood cells will move throughout the body. A little bit harder for them to move into the central nervous system around the brain. They can. They even move into the digestive system and will be found in the large intestine, the colon, the rectum, and even in diarrhea. If a person's suffering from a bacterial infection that's causing diarrhea, sometimes a stool sample will be taken, and not only do they look for the microbe, but they'll look for the white blood cells that will be present in the stool sample. And it's understood by most people that pimples, pus, would be filled with white blood cells and bacteria. Another structure that is found in blood would be the platelets. And in this image you see mostly red blood cells, you see a couple of white blood cells, and then you see some smaller dark staining structures, and those are the platelets. They're not always stained this color. Sometimes they're red, depending which stain is used in the tissue staining. It appears that they just used one stain, perhaps methylene blue, in this staining procedure, and so everything's blue that took up the stain. But those platelets are very small. They're very important in clotting. And sometimes when a person has a cut and it keeps bleeding, they'll tell you to use something rough, rough tissue on it, because that helps to break up the red blood cells and improves clotting. Some very sharp instruments cut, and it's hard to get the blood to stop flowing. Microtomes are a good example. They're used to cut tissue samples, very thin tissue samples. Another type of connective tissue is cartilage, and excuse me. I have an illustration here of cartilage that is at the ends of long bones, and specifically here it's in the knee joint. It shows healthy cartilage on the left and unhealthy or worn cartilage on the right. And sometimes this cartilage has to be taken out, and then you just have bone against bone. But one of the purposes of the cartilage is to cushion bone and allows for the bones to slide across each other more easily. Below the illustration is a picture taken through the microscope of cartilage cells, and you can see the cartilage cells, and then there's the non-living matrix around those cells. Excuse me again. Cartilage is also important in giving support. We see that with the nose and the ears, and helps to hold those structures in place for their function, better function. Helps us to breathe in the nose, and in the ears helps us to hear better. Cartilage is also a precursor to most of the bones in the skeleton. Most of our bones start out as cartilage and then eventually calcify into bone. This would be the bones of the axial skeleton. The bones of the cranium, most of those bones start out as membrane and not cartilage, but our long bones, the bones in our hands, arms, legs, feet, ribs, those we are told start out as cartilage and eventually calcify. And when a person gets into their 20s, generally their bones are fully calcified. Females' bones calcify sooner than male bones, interestingly. Talking about bones, that is another type of connective tissue, the most dense connective tissue. And I've got an image, an illustration of bone, and shows a long bone. Appears to be a femur, with the knee would be down at the bottom, hip would be at the top if it were shown. And it's showing the different parts of the bone. It shows the marrow, shows the epiphysis and the diaphysis, the epiphysis being the end of the bone, the diaphysis being the shaft of the bone, showing compact bone versus spongy bone. And it's not that it's actually made up of sponge, it's just less dense than the compact bone. And then there are these osteons, used to be called haversian canals, haversian canal systems, but they've come to be called osteons probably in the last 20, 30 years. And lacuna in Latin actually means pool. And so you have the bone cell, one type of bone cell is the osteocyte, in this lacuna, in this little opening of the bone. But bone tends to be very dense, but if you were to cut it and magnify it, you'd see it's made up of these smaller units. It's important to remember that bone is living. As long as we're alive, it's living and it grows. We're constantly breaking down bone and reforming bone. Elderly people, especially elderly women, have more of a problem with breaking it down faster than they're reforming it, and can develop a condition called osteoporosis, where If a lot of weight or force is put on a bone, it can break, it can fail. Sometimes this happens when they're stepping up, taking steps up stairs, and may not think about it much, but when you're taking a step for just a short period of time, you're putting a lot of weight on the neck, what you might call the neck of the femur, and that will sometimes cause it to break. It puts a lot of pressure on that part of the hip. Sometimes hip bones will break. Sometimes ribs will break. I've heard of cases of little ladies just rolling over in bed, or somebody rolling them, and their ribs being brittle enough, fragile enough that they break. Also, with female animals such as hogs, they can have a litter of pigs, 10, 15 pigs, sometimes a larger litter, and with those little pigs sucking milk from the female, biologists explain that organisms tend to favor their offspring, getting their genes to the next offspring to continue their kind. And we see this with domesticated hogs. Sometimes if they're not given enough calcium and phosphorus, especially enough calcium in their diet, the female sow will pull calcium from her bones to put into milk for her little piglets so that they grow properly. And there have been cases where hogs have stood up in a crate where they're confined and broken a leg, because you have a sow that's hundreds of pounds, maybe 400 or 500 pounds, maybe more in some cases, and they put a lot of force on that leg bone, and it can break. The bone is served by blood vessels and by nerves, and if you've ever broken a bone, you understand that there's pain involved because of the nerve supply to it. Bone has a number of purposes. One is to support muscles. It's a supporting framework for muscles to attach to move the body. It also serves as protection. I don't have a skeleton to show you, but if you were to consider areas of the body that need great amount of protection, one would be the cranium. So the cranial bones are positioned and have the thickness to properly protect the brain. Also, the ribs protect the vital organs of the heart, liver, the lungs, which we need to survive. And when you think about it, those bones, both in the cranium and the ribs, have a curved structure to them. Now, interestingly, I don't know about humans, but as cattle age, the curvature of the ribs decreases. I was at the University of Illinois in Urbana one time, and I stopped into a building when I was teaching up north, and started talking to one of the people, and he called me back to the back and said, "Hey, come back here and take a look at our hanging carcasses. I want to show you something that's interesting." And he showed me that just by looking at the carcass, you could tell whether it was a young beef or an older beef, just by the curvature of the ribs, and it was noticeable. After he showed me, I could distinguish between the two rather easily. But the curvature, that structural shape gives greater strength to structures, and interestingly, the ribs are curved and so are the cranial bones. Bones serve as an important reservoir of calcium and phosphorus, and if we don't get enough in our diet, we tend to pull it from our bones. And that's one of the reasons why females in their 20s and 30s are told to have enough calcium in their diet so that in their later ages they will not develop osteoporosis. Also, the bones, specifically the bone marrow, is important in the production of blood cells. In the next video, I will continue with a different type of tissue, muscle tissue.